Hello everyone, and welcome to the first PlayUK Salon in 2021. We hope that you enjoyed the holidays and that you are ready for a new series of talks with creatives and game dev professionals from the UK. The topic of tonight's Salon is building meaningful creative partnerships, and we will be joined by Sarah Brin. It can be tricky to describe Sarah. She's a writer, a curator, a creative producer who specializes in innovation with technologies, businesses, and disciplines. And she has helped develop new creative partnerships. She has led cross-disciplinary teams to create these playful hybrid projects, which are spanning video games, installations, and exhibitions. Sarah, it's really great to have you with us tonight. We're very eager to learn more about your work, which stands at this intersection of games, art, and technology. So could we start with you telling us more about yourself and your practice?
Amazing, yes. That's in the first part of my presentation. So should we get started with that part? Okay, cool. Let me share.
Yeah, let's jump right into it.
Yeah. Cool. Are we full screen here?
Yes, we are.
Okay, amazing. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. If you might be able to tell from my accent, I am not originally from the UK, so it means a lot to be invited by an institution representing my new adopted country to invite me to share about my work. So today we're going to talk a little bit about me and my background, and I tried to condense it into 5 top tips for making meaningful creative partnerships. I want very much for this to be useful to you all. As you might be able to tell from my presentation, I've worked across disciplines, including architecture, public space, the cultural sector, Fortune 500 companies, video games. But my hope is that you'll be able to kind of distill everything in terms of applying it to your practice. And of course, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for a Q&A, a conversation at the end, because usually that's the most fun part for me, at least. Okay, so if we get started, let me advance my slides. Okay, cool. So as you can tell from the poor quality of this picture, it's from a long time ago. And that's me. That is, gosh, I think this is like 2005 or 2006. And I'm a university student here. I went to university in a small school on the East Coast of the United States. And I spent most of my life in my childhood and most of my early adulthood thinking I was going to be a lawyer, because I grew up very lower middle class, and I thought that it was really irresponsible to have a creative profession. But in university, it's when I started to realize that I had so many friends who were really creative people, and I always felt this really strong gravity towards doing fun and interesting creative projects. And so this is an example of one of the first projects that made me realize, like, oh, I'm really good at getting groups of people together to do big, silly, creative things. So this is me and a group of my friends. We had a group called Art Attack, where we made these 30-foot tall images of monsters and put them up all over campus. We used a tool called a rasterizer to blow up images to make them larger. And it took many hours and lots of different kind of permissions from people on our campus, but it was a really successful project, and it kind of sparked something in me that I would carry on throughout my practice. I graduated university in 2008, which for some of you might know is the year of a major economic collapse. So it was not the most friendly job market. And so I decided to go to graduate school, which, you know, mixed decision. But I went to the curatorial program at the University of Southern California, which is in Los Angeles. And as soon as I got there, I felt tremendously out of place because, you know, as I mentioned, I had a background where I didn't grow up having a lot of disposable cash in my household. And a lot of my peers had the kind of families that could pay for them to do an unpaid internship over the summer, or could pay for them to intern at a gallery in Berlin. I didn't come from there. And so there's immediately this kind of gap between me and my cohort in graduate school. That gap was only exacerbated by my decision to study artist-made video games and the kind of interesting work that artists were doing with creativity and digital practice. So this is from a game called Lose Lose, created by Zach H. I would write a chapter about this in my master's thesis, and Zach would become one of my closest friends. But this is a mod, which means it looks like kind of a classic game, but part of it's been changed. So this is a mod of the classic game called Space Invaders, except for, you know, shooting an alien and having them disappear. Every time you shoot an alien in this game, it deletes a random file on your computer. And I thought this was really interesting because I liked the idea of having real world consequences to in-game actions. And I thought it was kind of playful and dangerous and edgy in a way that I hadn't seen art be before. And so despite the fact that many of my classmates and also my professors very much rolled their eyes at the fact that I was interested in games, when I finished my master's in 2011, 10 years ago, I started to work with a bunch of different museums in the States and abroad. And all these museums are starting to kind of recognize that games were an important kind of creative modality, and they were interesting, and they got people into the door of their museums. And one museum that I worked really closely with is SF-MoMA, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. So together, I worked with their head of interpretive media, Erica Gangsey, to create a series of programs. It's a permanent program called PlaySF-MoMA that is focused on games exhibitions, commissions, research projects, and residencies at the museum. And so this is from one of the projects we did that was timed in conjunction with GDC, the Game Developers Conference, many years ago. Part of why I think it's really important to have spaces for research with games that exist outside of the industry is there's room for experimentation that doesn't necessarily have to be profit motivated, but instead can be motivated by different kind of research questions. And I think this example here, this is actually a sound installation that's based on the game Mutazione. So this project is almost 8 years old. So the sound engine for Mutazione has been around, even though it's a game that just came out last year, but this is a really fun piece that kind of worked with it in its early stages. And so one of the research questions we were interested in here is, can you have a game without a screen? Can you have a digital game without a screen? And the answer is yes. What this is an array of PS Move controllers that are kind of hung in this arrangement in this little tent that we constructed. And based on how you interact with the controllers, it evokes different types of soundscapes. Through the success related to my games project, I was kind of able to leverage that prestige into a role at the software company Autodesk. You might be familiar with certain Autodesk products like Maya or AutoCAD, which is, they make a lot of different types of 3D modeling software. And I worked with them as the manager for their public programs and partnerships. So what I did is I got to work with a bunch of amazing artists, designers, architects, furniture makers, even chefs. And it was my job to work with those people to create beautiful and mediagenic projects that showcased what Autodesk tools could do. This is at a pretty neat facility in San Francisco, California called Pier 9, and it's full of 3D printers, CNC machines, water jet cutters, textile lab, all kinds of stuff. So it's used to be a very kind of wild and compelling place. This is just one of the examples of the projects that we made. This is a 3D printed zoetrope created by an artist called John Edmark, which I think is really special. I love that it's made with a plaster 3D printer because I think plaster is a more sustainable form of 3D printing in a lot of ways. So this is one of the fun projects I got to do. It was a partnership between Autodesk, the Market Street Prototyping Festival, which is kind of like an urban ingenuity related festival in San Francisco, and the incredible Montreal-based experienced designers Daily Tool Azure. And Autodesk set aside a pot of money to do an interesting public installation for the Market Street Prototyping Festival. And we put out a call for proposals, and we said, you know, whatever we want it to be is we want it to be site specific. So we want it to respond to the kind of unique nature of this specific part of San Francisco. We want it to showcase in one way or another the affordances of digital fabrication. So if you use our tools in Pier 9, we want to be able to see in the project how and where you use those tools. And we want it to be playful and fun. And so what I loved about Daily Toulajour's proposal is that they wrote to us and they said, we can't submit an idea to you because you want it to be site specific. And in order to submit a truly site specific idea, we have to observe and evaluate the space. And I was like, well, that's absolutely correct. Making site specific work isn't just about what a space looks like. It's about how people move in a space, who is in the space, the history of that place, and responding to that thoughtfully. And they really came through for us with this project called Knock Stop Music, which is a series of musical traffic lights in which you can communicate with each other with strangers on the opposite sides of the streets by playing music together, which is a really special project. And of course, this was a prototype, so you could see that a lot of it's made out of sheet metal and cardboard, which are pretty kind of affordable materials. Another partnership project I did at Autodesk was called Art in Space, where I worked with the satellite imaging company Planet Labs to create the largest art exhibition in outer space. To condense the process, they make very small satellites. We teamed up with them to get our community of artists to laser etch art into those satellites. Those satellites were shipped to the International Space Station and they were deployed into orbit, where they hung out for 3 years before burning up in Earth's atmosphere. We also made duplicates of all of the satellites so we could have a party and admire them back on Earth. Another project I should mention is that I worked for 2 years at the immersive experience design company Meow Wolf, which is backed by Game of Thrones creator George R.R. Martin. And that's based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and soon will be opening in Las Vegas as well. But what this place is it's not necessarily a game, but in many ways is very game-like. It's a physical installation that looks like a regular house. Actually, the first time I went here, I went with Marie Fulston, who is part of the PlayUK team, as well as our pals from House House, and it was a really special memory. And based on my experience with them there, I went to go work there. So as I mentioned, it's a regular house until you start to take a closer look. And everything in the house is fully interactable and touchable. So you can turn on the TV and it's going to show you TV content that tells you more about the story world that you're in. You go to pick up books off a shelf and the books are going to tell you more about the story world that you're in. You log on to the computer, it does the same thing. As you explore the house, you start to uncover a little bit more about who the family is that lives in this house, and that something strange has happened. And also, in addition to there being something strange that happened, you'll notice that there are portals to alternative dimensions that you can go through, including this portal in the fridge and this portal in the washing machine. Once you travel through the portals, you enter into fantastical kind of 360 art installations that are, again, kind of fully navigable. When I worked at Meow Wolf, I led their public programs, their partnerships initiatives, especially in relationship to technology. So that looked like a bunch of different things, and we worked with a whole bunch of other companies, including Magic Leap, the AR company. So this is a project we did called The Navigator, and we wanted to create an AR experience that was compelling for not just the person who was wearing the headset, but for spectators as well. So this is a interactive sculpture, and it delivers light, sound, and haptic feedback based on what's going on in the headset. And there's a whole kind of narrative component as well. Magic Leap reached out to us because they wanted a creative showcase for what their hardware could do. And so I would say that is definitely one of the main channels for creative partnerships. and technology, which is to kind of this idea of showing off and creating an immersive world or an immersive project in a way that kind of extends beyond the feeling of just kind of being on a tech expo floor. Although I think a lot of us might be missing that weird feeling of being in a crowded expo floor right now, in one way or another. Another project we did was with Microsoft and their volumetric capture studio. They set up a volumetric stage to kind of showcase their Azure volumetric capture capabilities, which are pretty amazing. You can take 360 scans and get really high quality assets that you can kind of port across different digital platforms. So we, in addition to making 360 scans of characters in the Meow Wolf universe, this is Alva, kind of an interdimensional travel agent. Individuals were able to, members of the public were able to take 360 scans of themselves and create holograms of themselves. And the premise was that it was an interdimensional travel agency. So while you as a human could stay on Earth, your duplicate, your hologram could travel throughout the multiverse. I always forget about this project. So I worked as a producer for Rolls-Royce's art program, which is called Muse, and I worked on something called the Dream Commission for them. And I worked with 4 different artists to create short form moving image pieces that to kind of showcase the idea of dreams. And you might ask, okay, well, why is a car company supporting art projects? Is it art about cars? And it's like, no, it's not art about cars. But I think that part of how companies build influence and prestige, especially luxury brands like Rolls-Royce, is through programs like these, because they just kind of they are able to attract kind of cultural cachet and a certain type of like gravity by doing cool stuff. So essentially, marketing, very, 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 very fancy marketing. So you might think, okay, well, I want to get some of that sweet, sweet marketing money. We'll talk about how to do that, but also it's not so easy. So we'll talk about some of the nuances that are important to take into consideration there. And of course, my current role, I work as a senior producer on the outreach team at Media Molecule, which I am super psyched about. I won't be talking very much about my work there today, but I work as a senior outreach producer for Dreams, which is a game engine disguised as a game. So within it, there are many, 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 many games that are created by all kinds of people. But also really, really powerful tools that can be used not only for game development, but also for film, TV, music creation, and lots more. So I'm really excited to be with them, and it feels like a good transition based on my prior career work. So, okay, so now I'm going to start with my top 5 tips for how you too can orchestrate successful creative partnerships. So number 5, I'm going to count down, is pay attention. Having worked in so many partnerships roles, I've met other business development people, and I find I get kind of frustrated because a lot of it is just talking about nothing. And so you'll find that people will be like, oh yeah, we should talk, or we should do a project. And then it'll just be like, oh yeah, maybe, maybe, maybe. And it just is so abstract. You never actually get anywhere. So while it might seem scary and direct, it's actually a great idea to ask these questions. When you're talking to someone about the idea of a partnership, you can always ask, what would a successful partnership look like to you? So as I mentioned earlier, when I was working at Autodesk, I was looking for projects that could be mediagenic to get a lot of press attention. I was looking for projects that made it digital fabrication processes legible. I wanted normal people to be able to look at an object and be like, oh, hey, this is 3D printed. I think often companies or large organizations might not know what a successful partnership looks like to them. But sometimes they do. And I think it's always good to ask that, because even if people don't know what their answers are off the bat, it's an important way to start a question and a series of inquiries, because people don't do things just because they're cool. They do things because they deliver ROI, return on an investment. So how, once you figure out what success might look like to a potential partner, you want to put together a proposal. I think a lot of people get intimidated by proposals and they overthink them. I make like I make like 7 decks a week. So once you get the hang of it and you make a template, it's really not that bad. But okay, so what are the components of the pitch? Usually I make these in Keynote and I save them as a PDF. You can make them in whatever format you want, but it's important that there be a visual component, and you should keep it short and sweet and include kind of these main points of information. So what is your plan? Keep it short. I don't want to read a book. You should be able to distill your project into 2 to 5 sentences max. Also, I want to know why, as a potential partner, why would I want to support this partnership, which might be me providing money to you. It might be co-branding something. It might be lending or giving you hardware, right? So I want to be convinced, or I want to understand why this partnership is a good idea. So is it timely? Is it unique? Could you do this with another company? Does it showcase something that my company needs help with, or that we're kind of really keen on messaging right now? We also want to know who your team are, their amazing credentials. If it's just you, we're going to raise some eyebrows, be like, how is this one person going to do all this stuff? I want to see a schedule, as well as understand what your venue is and who your audience is. And I also want to know that you understand who your audience is, and not just have it be for everybody, because I think that part of success metrics, in terms of, especially because so many creative partnerships are marketing related, I think it's very important to understand who your target demographics are, so that you can convert that into clicks or purchases or eyeballs or social media follows or all that stuff. I want to know how. I want to see your production plan and your budget. And I also want to know what the deliverables are going to be. So that might be an end product like a game or a prototype. And I also, sometimes it's really, really valuable to do an evaluation at the end of these processes, especially if you're doing a partnership that's like kind of more R&D focused, which might be something where like a company gives you a particular piece of hardware to use for free or at a lower cost. Having a case study that kind of evaluates what you did and how you did it and what happened can actually be really, really appealing, because that's information that a particular company or institution might not have. So here's an example of like kind of setting the stage of like how, if I was going to talk to you about an online game, I would set the scene and I was like, hey, look, you know, online games are kind of growing and they're eclipsing, you know, traditional media forms of media in a really big and meaningful way. There's a lot of money floating around. I, you know, talk about like, look how expansive the market is, and I can use other people's data to contextualize my own arguments. That's totally okay. And as a matter of fact, it strengthens my argument because it shows that I've done my research and then I understand the field that I'm trying to work within. It's important, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of show who your team is, especially if the people on your team are fancy, if they have nice credentials. I want to be able to show that off, because that again just lends more credibility and power. And, you know, this is the dream team that I compiled. So as I mentioned earlier, structure and milestones are really, really important for a project. And that includes identifying, you know, when your target delivery dates are, creating a schedule that looks something like this. As you can see, this isn't particularly granular, it's not particularly detailed, but I want to see, as a potential partner who might be investing, you know, significant amount of money in a project, that you know how to plan a project, you know how to execute a project, and that I'm not just throwing my money away with people who don't know what they're doing. So this is really important to demonstrate, as well as a budget. This is a vastly oversimplified budget. Again, not super detailed, but I do want to see, you know, where the money is going. And so if you say, hey, I want £1 million British pounds. And I'm just like, okay, well, I have £1 million British pounds, but like, what are you going to do with it? But whereas if you come to me and be like, hey, I need £30,000 for this, and I need £90,000 for this particular expense, I'm gonna be like, oh, okay, that all seems reasonable. You've thought about this. Another thing I always love to do is when I put together budgets, especially the producer in me, I always add a contingency. I think that's okay, and that's standard practice. I usually stick to about 15% contingency of my overall project budget, just as a pocket for me to deal with unexpected expenses or change. I also include a 15% contingency when I'm doing schedules as well, so calendars and time. So if something needs to change, we're not kind of absolutely down to the wire. Oh yeah, so these are some of the examples of potential deliverables that might be interesting at the end of a project. So you might want to drive players to a particular online game, or your game itself might be the deliverable. Sometimes people want subscribers to join their mailing lists or social followers to join them. Videos and photos are also really important deliverables for projects when it's possible, as well as concept art, because as I mentioned earlier, having a visual argument can be really, really persuasive, and your partner might want those images or videos for user research, for marketing, all kinds of stuff. So that's really valuable. Especially if you have an R&D related partnership, it is really important to do a case study, because that's the R in R&D, right? If it's research and development. Case studies can look like a million different things, but it's actually really, really valuable for companies to understand what a use case is. So take, for example, that Magic Leap project that I worked on. It was valuable information for Magic Leap to know, like, hey, when we did this particular experience, the hardware got really hot, right? Or like, hey, when we deployed it in this context, like, it broke, or like, would we be able to tweak this so the import from Unreal went more seamlessly? And that helped then make a better or a different project. And of course, prestige is a huge thing too. Like I mentioned with the Rolls-Royce partnerships, like sometimes prestige can be really, really valuable to a brand. And by doing a creative project or an interesting project, or lending your cred as a creative, that can be a really, really valuable deliverable, as well as, of course, user data. That's also really, really valuable to a lot of companies as well. Yes, code switching. Okay, so some of you might be very familiar with code switching, because I think that probably most of you are multilingual, if not multicultural as well. So code switching actually comes from sociology, and it's the process of moving between two languages or two cultures in the same language. And usually this happens more in conversation than in writing. So a good example is, I'm from America. We say things like trash and garbage, and in the United Kingdom, we say things like bins and rubbish. So I said the other day, like, I'm gonna put the rubbish, the rubbish in the garbage cans. So just everything mixing together. Now, this also has implications in business. So different industries, different companies, and often different departments within a particular institution or a company are going to have their own specific language and jargon. You might be able to kind of think of a lot of different examples, but here are just some examples here. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that some jargon from game dev might be this idea of like a bundle, right? While it might feel obvious to you that you know what a bundle is, like someone who works for, I don't know, even Magic Leap, or someone who works at a company like in the marketing department of a company like Autodesk, they might not know. So you're going to need to explain. And if you use things like, if you talk to, a more traditional business person about OpenGL, they're not going to know what you're talking about. So you're going to need to kind of use different vocabulary in order to be understood. That's, takes some practice. It's not hard once you learn how to do it, but I think it takes a lot of paying attention to listen to the particular audiences that you want to reach and use their language because you want to make sure that they understand you. So this is a really, really good way to kind of practice or learn how to do that code switching, which is by doing alignment with company talking points and quarterly goals. And you might be like, wow, how am I going to know what your quarterly goals are, big company that I want lots of money from? So here is an example, and it has nothing to do with my job, but you might have, you might be aware that CES is happening right now. So the Consumer Electronics Showcase, a big digital tech conference. So all of these tech companies, including companies in games, are doing press releases and announcements about what they're working on right now. So if you look, if there's a company that you think might be a good partnership for you, like Epic and their mega grants, or this one's from Sony, take a look at their announcements and find what you think are the core values they're talking about here. So I highlighted the ones that I thought were interesting or relevant in this kind of Sony press release. So if I was pitching to Sony, I'd want to make sure that I emphasize the values of things being like reality, real time, and remote. This idea of kondo, which is kind of like a Japanese concept that means like this kind of wow factor. I know that they're interested in this idea of the immersive entertainment experiences and technology for a better future. And so if I'm working with volumetric capture technology, this might be a really good fit for me to try to pitch to Sony. If I'm making an 8-bit retro game, probably not going to be a good fit for me to pitch to Sony. I might want to consider a different platform because right now they're really interested in this idea of virtual production technology and volumetric acquisition, which means there's like a particular type of aesthetic and image quality that would not be compatible with an 8-bit aesthetic. So that's just an example of something that you can do when you're thinking about who might be good potential partners for you, is pay attention to the news, think of companies that might be a good fit, and then look up what they're saying at places like CES, GDC, shareholder meetings. Oh yeah, this is really important to be conscious of. Usually, and there are always exceptions to the rules, the larger an organization is, the slower it can get or the more dysfunctional it can get. That means usually this happens because there's ideas that have to go through multiple departments for approvals. To harken back to that code switching idea, different departments in the same organization will have different kind of values and vocabularies, and the process and bureaucracy can slow things down a lot. So this is kind of a chart that demonstrates that usually older organizations in Horizon 1 or larger organizations are going to be slower to adopt change. So those are like your big museums, your more old school tech companies. You can see in it's going to be more well known, but those kind of more historic organizations are going to be more resistant or skeptical of change, including new technologies. And you can see that as organizations become newer or more experimental, they have less to lose. So you'll see that those organizations are going to be more likely to do something different or support an experimental project, especially related to technology. So that's just something to keep in mind. And an example would be, as someone who's worked in museums a lot, I found that SF MoMA was very much an exception to many other museums, and that they were so ready to adopt working with games. But even when I worked with them, I noticed that I had to have, maybe about 100 hours worth of meetings for every project to make sure that we got approvals from all these different departments. Whereas when I worked at a company like Autodesk, I would say, hey, can I do this? And they'd be like, sure, because they weren't concerned with art history. They had different ROIs, or they had different KPIs. They had different key performance indicators. That's me switching into corporate jargon. Anyways, and when you work in a partnership, you have to prepare yourself for feedback in a way that you might not be used to when you're used to doing projects on with yourself or your friends. And because often there's money exchanged, you might be asked to make changes because instead of a collaborative relationship, you might find yourself in a client relationship in which your needs become secondary to your clients. This isn't for everyone, and this isn't what every partnership looks like, but it does require a certain amount of compromise. So when you embark upon a large partnership project, you should kind of think about the fact, like, okay, which parts of this would be what I would be willing to change? How much is this project about me? And if you find that some projects are best kept personal, and some projects, you just want to make them so you can share them with larger audiences. So it's important to be honest with yourself about that. And I also think, oh gosh, talk about code switching. Delivering feedback also really is different between different disciplines. So I give feedback in a really specific way. I usually ask questions when I give feedback rather than I say it's like this, but instead I'll say things like, what kinds of audiences were you thinking about when you were making this, as opposed to no one's going to like this. But I think that, depending on who you speak to, they might be more or less direct with their feedback, and that's also something you need to steel yourself for, something you actually want to do. To talk about the idea of large companies or organizations being slow, just because a company has budget doesn't mean it is not dysfunctional. So these are pretty common dysfunctions that you see in organizations. What I would say is special projects and partnerships are not exempt from this type of dysfunction. And as a matter of fact, the pre-existing dysfunctions that exist within an organization are only magnified and amplified in special projects, especially if there's a component of risk involved, especially if an organization is doing something new or experimental. You might kind of see some of these bad behaviors come to life, which is another important thing to steel yourself for if that's what you're up for. And of course, this is an issue that I am too familiar with, is talk about organizational dysfunction kind of being pervasive. So is discrimination based on race, gender, sexual orientation, and disability. And so, especially if you're working on corporate partnerships, you might find that your corporate partners look like this. And so if you are used to doing partnerships in the arts sector or in the cultural sector or in a sector where that actually has a discourse related to equality and an awareness of systemic injustice, it might be kind of a shock to work with an organization that's not. So these are all really important things to keep in mind when you yourself as a potential partner are assessing whether or not you want to embark in a particular partnership, because it's not just you getting something, you are also delivering value. So subsequently, it's also important for you to really, really assess, like, oh, okay, well, if they write me a check, or if they give me this hardware I really want, is it worth it? Is it worth working with these particular people who might ask me to do these particular things with my work? And a lot of times the answer is yes, but it's really, really, really important to be able to say no sometimes. And my final tip before we go into the Q&A is communicate. So you cannot ask for too much feedback. I know I mentioned that some individuals might be bad at it. It's really important because you don't want, especially if a company is really busy with other projects, they might just forget about you if you don't make yourself visible, and then it might become the end of your project. And if you haven't asked for feedback, they might be like, oh, this isn't what we asked for or wanted at all, and that it can be an unpleasant situation. So it's really, really good to ask for feedback throughout the breadth of your partnership. And it's also really important to ask a lot of questions, not only because you have particular questions, but because you might flag things that your partners aren't thinking of. And again, you're contributing to this partnership. They want to work with you, or they're interested in working with you because you have an awareness of a particular skill or access to a particular audience that they don't have. So it's really, really important that you make sure that you have a common understanding, and asking questions is a really important way to do that. It might feel really, really intimidating to be, what you might perceive as like, a small-time artist or a small-time designer talking to a big-time company, but they're just people. It's just people. So don't assume that they have the answers, but it's really important to try to find them. And another way to kind of ensure that your project comes to fruition successfully is to set up milestone reviews. I like to tie these to payment too. So it's not just you get a big chunk of money at the end, you get a chunk of money as you work. And defining, okay, well, when it's 30% done, I want to have a meeting with all the stakeholders and they give me feedback and I'm going to deliver this prototype. I usually like to do 30, 60, 90 reviews, and that's 30%, 60%, 90% complete. But I also think, something like a weekly check-in might be really time consuming, but it's really, really worth it to make sure that you continue to be aware of the concerns and interests of your partner, because again, they might have visibility or particular concerns that you would have never have thought of, that they might think So the more communication, the better. Also, ask for help. I think that humans in general are really bad at asking for help. And if you don't understand something or something appears not clear to you, it's much better to flag that and let your partner know, like, hey, like, I'm running out of budget, or like, hey, can I have access to your laser cutter? Or hey, can we borrow some of your employees for a user test? I think all of these are really important things, but I think that sometimes we are expected to be hyper competent, capable, superhuman people that never need help. But actually, it's a real power move to say, "Whoa, I don't know," because that is a way to get information much faster than you would otherwise, and that way you're not like letting your pride keep you stuck on stupid blockers, which I see happen all the time. When I produced projects at many places, I would be having one-on-ones with people on my team, and I'd ask them, how's this project going? And they'd be like, well, I'm stuck on this and this and this. And I'd be like, oh, did you ask so-and-so? Because that's what so-and-so does all day long. I'd be like, no, I can figure it out. And like, I'd be like, well, let's get up and walk over to their desk. And of course, sure enough, the problem would be resolved instantly. But also, it's harder to do that now because we can't walk over to people's desks, but we can shoot them Slack messages. We can call them on the phone. We can email them. So strong recommend for asking for help. And now I'd like to take us to the Q&A. I'm nice. I won't judge you if you have silly questions.
No worries. We won't be having like any silly questions. Our audiences are really great. We are already like flooded with lots of questions. But first, like, let's give you like a couple of seconds to take everything. And Sarah, thank you so much for sharing more about your background and the roles you take and the responsibilities you have, and especially for focusing like this big chunk of your presentation on advice for anyone who's interested in this line of work. It's very precious, like, to hear it firsthand. Awesome. So now, since you've been like mentioning code switching so much, so in our conversation earlier, you have mentioned how you have lived across the USA, in Denmark and UK. So we're talking about like many different places. And how has that influenced your perspective and your perspective on business and on what you do?
Definitely. Well, I think especially when it comes to design, there is a particular ideology around design that comes from Silicon Valley, which is this idea of kind of like fail faster, fail harder, do these rapid prototypes. And I think especially earlier in my career, I was like, this is the way to do design. This is great. But when I started, working on research projects with partners across Europe, I realized like, oh, wait, no, these companies don't necessarily, or rather these museums don't have the room to fail fast because they're publicly funded. So they receive a different type of scrutiny that a Silicon Valley tech company might not receive. So they require a different approach to design. And it's really important to understand who you're co-designing with and what their concerns are emotionally, personally, as humans, because that's going to be a really big part of the success of what you build together. And those approaches to kind of design and experimentation vary wildly depending on where you are geographically or culturally.
I get it. And what would you say, like, what would you describe as your like breakthrough project, like the one that opened the door for working with these huge brands that you have had a chance to work on?
Yeah, I think working with SF MoMA was a huge thing in my career, because my first project with them was right after I finished my master's research, I had done all this scholarship about artists and games, and a friend introduced me to who would become my collaborator at the museum, Erica, and they had me just come in and work on a panel. And then a couple months later, they had me do an installation in their lobby and design a game. And a couple months later, they had me do more research. And just having a really good relationship with that organization allowed me to do bigger projects with them, but also to leverage the name of SF MoMA, which a lot of people knew and understood and associated with prestige, into more opportunities, which I'm really thankful for.
Cool. And how would you say that, how receptive have you found these big brands to be in patronage of video games? So do you think that games have or could have like the capacity to provide these brands with the same like cultural cash as the art they support? You've already stressed like one big difference earlier, so let's hear about this.
In one of like the example slides I showed earlier, I just showed that games are just growing so much in terms of eclipsing other forms of media like film or TV or music, especially live music. And we're of course starting to see, and of course because of COVID, we have people who are stuck at home. And we've been seeing for years and years and years now that the audience for games extends far beyond like a stereotypical gamer. You see lots of BIPOC folks and women playing games and buying games. And I think that the recent project that Balenciaga, the fashion brand, did with PlayStation about a month ago, I think is a great example. Like Balenciaga, a high fashion luxury brand working with games. So I think that everyone knows it's a big deal. I think people are going to be if they get scared about anything, they should be scared about how much it costs to do it well, because game designers cost money, as well as understanding the technology that's involved, because not every company is going to have an understanding of how game engines or web publishing works in the same way.
I get it. And actually, like, how do you actually like come up with an idea like for a project, and like what like in your when you were giving out advice for making like a pitch, you stressed out how important it is like to give that information like to the company what they could like benefit from. Like how do you do your research? Like actually, like how do you divide it? Like how do you know like what data to look in, like what to extract, and to create like something meaningful and something that will have an impact on all the participants?
There's you know a few different channels, and I think a lot of it is seeing how different pieces fit together. So number one, have friends. And you know, especially if you're earlier career, the friends you make, you know, they're in a similar position as you, and then it's kind of cool to see things change as you stay friends over time. And so sometimes those friends, you know, work at a company and they was like, hey, we're working on this and this and this, and that's one way to find information. I'm a huge dork and I have a lot of RSS feeds that I use a service called Feedly to compile. So basically like all of these kind of news and tech and art websites, I compile through my Feedly, and so I read them all. Well, I don't read them all. I spend time every day going through them. Social media helps a lot. And you can't pay attention to everything all the time, right? But I like to think about, especially if I'm working with technologists, I like to let their research questions drive the project. So if I'm working with an engineer who is really interested in large scale AR, headset-based AR, I'm gonna like take their idea, their pitch, and pitch it to AR-based companies. And I'm not going to be like, hey, ooh, this tech company has a grant. Let's come up with an idea for that, because then you're just only going to be coming up with like new ideas, new ideas, new ideas, new ideas. That's exhausting and unsustainable. But if you have an idea that you have a personal research interest in or a personal attachment to, then it's easier to shop that around and make small tweaks based on who you're pitching that to.
Cool. And how do you get to the people or organization that you pitch to? Like, how do you get your foot to the door? And also, like, have you found this easier or harder when reaching out from different types of places? Like,
oh yeah. So
and also, yeah, sorry, is it like easier to, yeah, this is one of the questions from our audience, like, is it easier to reach out as an individual or as a part of an organization?
Yeah, it depends. I think sometimes if you're part of an organization, even if it's like you're saying we and it's just you, that can lend a particular more power to a particular request and make you seem organized, which can be really useful. As I mentioned earlier, you know, I'm very privileged, and I've been working in the games industry for, you know, over a decade now. So I have friends who work at places. So, you know, I'm always going to go to a friend first. I do a lot of public speaking, and through that, I get to meet a bunch of people who, you know, work in various industries who do similar stuff. So I build up my contacts that way. Also, I'm a big fan of emailing the info app address at any particular company, being like, hi, do you have a marketing person I can talk to? Or here's an idea, could you send this to someone? Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I also find people on LinkedIn. Sometimes this is very annoying, but I'd be like, oh, I see that you're in charge of marketing at Microsoft. Can I have a HoloLens? And of course, like that's a moment in which you definitely want to demonstrate that, like, you're not just anybody, right? So Meow Wolf is a weird thing because people know who George R. R. Martin is, which is, people know what Game of Thrones is, but a lot of people didn't know what Meow Wolf was. So I would always make sure that I mentioned George R. R. Martin when I was making a request, and I also made sure that I linked to an article about us in the New York Times to just be like, hey, we're not just a bunch of teenagers.
Yeah.
And that kind of prestige, like demonstrating that you have that clout, can be really important, or pretending like you have that clout can be really useful when you're making inquiries like that. If you're earlier career, that's okay too. I think, but it's just a good idea to just be very gracious in your request and understand that no one owes you their time. But if you are polite and enthusiastic, usually people are really, really happy to hear from you.
Cool, awesome. And yeah, now that you have sent your cold email, it's probably time to send that pitch deck again. We have a question like from the audience who is Michaela is interested in pitch decks, like are they like CVs? Do you tailor them to each organization, or do you tailor them to like the specific project that you like want to highlight and bring to them?
Both. So if I have a particular project that I'm sharing with multiple partners, I will make individual tweaks on particular decks based on the type of language I've heard a company use, based on what I know that they're interested in. You know, if I have members of my team that used to work at their company or did something similar, I want to be able to kind of highlight them more than I might normally. But yeah, it's good to be specific when you can in these types of pitches.
Cool. And yeah, also like earlier in your talk, you mentioned how important it is to ask the client about their expectations and what success is for them. But I'm wondering, like, what happens when you ask the same question to yourself? Like, what are your success metrics? Like, yeah, on your curator side, what makes your project like super successful and something that you're content with?
Yeah, well, I want to make sure harm reduction is a pretty important one. So I want to make sure I'm not actively making the world worse based on what I'm doing. So thinking about ecological impact, is that really important? Thinking about my own personal health and safety, like, are these people who I want to work with? Are they nice? Do I have time? I think it can be really, really scary to say no or to set a boundary, but no one else is going to look out for you the way you can. So it's really important to do that. I'm generally very interested in projects that are playful. I love projects in public space. I like when things are accessible and inclusive and friendly. I think it's really important to do technology-driven projects that are accessible to non-technology experts, because technology affects the ways we live, work, play, and eventually not work.
Is that like the key message that you want all the participants to take away with them, like how technology is?
I want people to, the key message is I want people to understand the world is not set in stone, and just because things are a certain way doesn't mean that's the way they have to be.
Cool, awesome. And now just a quick talk, about negotiating with partners. So after you have like presented them your vision for the project, like how do you negotiate fees with your partners, and what's the best way to showcase like the impact of this project to them?
It's going to be different for everybody, but as far as fees are concerned, it's good to think about what your hourly rate is. And I know that when I work with a bunch of different companies, they'll be like, they use this phrase that is very gendered. They'll be like your man work hours. We're like, oh, generally man work hours in this company are, $50 US an hour. There's 25 of us, so the total fee for a month is blah, blah, blah. And so you might decide that with your colleagues that each of you have different rates, but you should calendar out how much time you think it will take to complete a particular project, like is important to include in your proposal, and then add 15% contingency. So like 50%, at least 50% more time than you think it will take, as well as 15% more money than what you've calculated for that period of time. And that's my recommendation for saying how much things cost. Oh, plus materials, if you need physical materials, that's also really important too. Intellectual property, we didn't get a chance to really talk about that. Is your partner going to have exclusive rights over your intellectual property, your idea, any characters in your game, any music in your game, or is it going to be a limited use agreement in which they just have access to it for a particular project? If you are signing over your IP comprehensively, you might factor that into your rate as well. Also important to take into consideration, like can you live? Can you live the life that you want with the budget allotted to you from this project? That's also really probably the most important thing to take into consideration. And of course, these amounts should be rooted in reality, but also something to keep in mind is that there is a gender and racial pay gap that I believe is, varies internationally, but I can tell you that at least in the United States, women don't make as much as men, and white women make more than women who are Black or brown. So also something to think about, like, are you charging as much money as a white man might? So in which case, bump up your fees a little bit.
Yeah, that's always good advice.
Yeah.
So you were talking about how also, like, you had a chance to work with a range of people, like that some of your associates even included chefs. So actually, like, how is it like working with a big team with people like coming from different sides of businesses? Like, how do you successfully like bring them around an idea and lead them to till the end of the project?
It's hard. People have different ways of working. People have different needs. People have different lives outside of work. People have different, psychological baggage. People have different work experience. So there's a couple questions that I like to ask for myself and to ask the people that I'm working with, which is, how will I know if I'm doing a good job? How will I know if I'm doing a not so good job? And as well as, if something needs to change, how will you tell me? And what do you really want me to know about you? As well as, like, what are your desired ways to communicate? Like, can I text you at 7 o'clock in the morning, or does that feel like a little bit out of control? Like, do you want to get emails on the weekends? And I think that those kind of boundaries are really, really important to talk about. And also, I think trust is really, 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 really important, because at the end of the day, you might have all kinds of different people with all kinds of different preferences and working styles. But if you trust each other and the work and the quality of the work that you will deliver, then it's a lot easier to collaborate, as opposed to if you're second guessing everyone.
Cool. And since we're at the memories of 2020 are still so fresh. So I'm wondering, like, how has the COVID situation affected your line of work? Like, what are the new challenges, and maybe, like, are there some new opportunities created by this situation?
Totally. Well, when I was working at Meow Wolf, they laid off, or they let go, they made redundant over half their staff, including me, because of COVID, right? So their admission fees were gone. Their budget was totally borked. And so I lost my job, and I was terrified, and I was like, and I moved to England like a crazy person because it was a place where I felt like I had the most social support, and where there are professional opportunities for me, because I've done a lot of work in the UK, and I was really lucky for that to come together. But yes, there are definitely opportunities related to COVID, because as we talked about earlier, like, digital games are just really, 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 really continuing to have a moment, because people are inside. We have the launch of the PlayStation 5 console. We have Fortnite and Roblox doing all of these really interesting kind of live events on their platforms. This is also obviously a huge moment for streaming media. I am very curious to what will happen to these forms of media post-COVID. I don't think any of them are going to go away, but I wonder if there'll be a little bit of backlash because people want to go outside. I certainly will.
Yeah, that's the only thing I wish in this new year, not ever like to be in quarantine again.
Yeah, me too.
Cool. Okay, so Sarah, for my last question, I would just like to learn more. Can you tell us, like, how has your curation, like, how has your perspective and like your creation practices, how has it changed like from that first project that actually like sparked your interest for doing this line of work? Like, what are like the major lessons that you learn, or what were those like major events that helped you like become the creative producer that you are today?
I'm really embarrassed to say that I think I've curated all my exhibitions before. Huge cringe. Like, that's something I would never do now, but I think I was like, oh no, I picked the people who made interesting work, and I didn't really take into consideration my responsibility as someone who could provide a platform to people, and that's something I would certainly never do ever again. And I think that I said yes to projects where I didn't really have the time or mental space, and kind of crunched to make them happen at like my own expense, and the expense of my health. And that's something, to be honest, that's something I still struggle with. But I think I'm definitely better at saying no to projects. I think this is very common. The worry that if you say no to a project, then no one will ever ask you to do a project ever again. That's not true. It's not true. No matter who you are, it's not true. So please internalize that in your heart, in your mind, in your soul. What else? I think I didn't consider environmental or kind of ethical impact in the same way. I think that now I'm kind of very keenly aware of the fact that I used to really want to work with luxury brands. And now that I spent time working with luxury brands, I realized that there are so many constraints. There are so many limits on what you can and can't do creatively, that I just got that out of my system, and I'm really glad I don't care about that anymore. But yeah, so those are some of the big ones.
Cool, awesome. Sarah, thank you so much for your talk, and especially for sharing such personal advice, like for sharing your personal stories, and like for for being like so supportive towards everyone who is interested in pursuing a career like yours. It was a real pleasure like having you here, and you've done a great job actually like explaining what you do, and what impact your work has can have on one's life. It was really awesome. And also, I'd like to remind everyone that the video of this session will be also available in a couple of days on British Council's website, so you can always revisit all everything that Sarah shared with us tonight. Cool. We really hope. Okay, cool. Sarah, unfortunately, we cannot hear you. I think that you like accidentally muted yourself. Okay. Sarah will have to say goodbye like this without words. Okay, it was really a pleasure having you here. Also, I'd like to remind everyone that our next PlayUK Salon will be held on January 27th, and that we will be joined by Ben Nissen, a senior level designer, and Alex Whaley, a client engineer from Mediatonic. And they will be telling us the story behind level design of Fall Guys. So see you in 2 weeks, and thank you for being with us tonight. Bye, everyone.